2 towns, 48 hours, and the Kremlin is not explaining it. Let that settle for a moment, because what happened on those 2 stretches of frontline ground in eastern Ukraine was not a skirmish. It was not a local adjustment. It was not the fog of war producing a temporary reversal that Russian logistics will simply correct next week. What happened was a precise, coordinated demonstration that Ukraine has solved a problem Russia still does not understand it has. And until you grasp what that problem actually is, not the headline version, but the structural version, you will keep misreading every piece of news that comes out of this war. I have spent decades studying how armies move, how they hold, and more critically, how they collapse. And the pattern I am watching unfold along those 2 recaptured positions fits a template I have seen before. It is not a template of battlefield improvisation. It is a template of doctrinal failure meeting doctrinal adaptation. Russia built a defensive posture around a set of assumptions that made sense in 1985. Ukraine systematically invalidated every single one of them. And the retreat you just watched on the map, those 2 red to blue flips in 48 hours, is the invoice arriving for years of misplaced confidence. This is not a story about 2 towns. It is a story about why the entire Russian positional defense model is cracking at its structural load points. And by the time this analysis is finished, you will understand not just what happened, but why it was always going to happen. Pull the lens back, because where we are right now is the result of a long compounding chain of miscalculations that started well before the first Ukrainian assault element moved into position. When Russia consolidated its defensive lines through late 2023 and into 2024, the doctrine guiding those positions was not improvised. It was deliberate. It reflected a specific theory of static defense inherited from Soviet-era thinking and adapted, or rather not adequately adapted, for a modern lethal environment. The theory ran like this: occupy fortified ground, establish overlapping fields of fire, use artillery depth to punish any attacker who crosses the exposed approach, and trust that the cost of assault will always exceed the benefit of the objective. Hold the line, bleed the attacker, wait for political will to collapse in Kyiv and Brussels and Washington. That theory had internal logic. It had worked in other contexts. And for a period, along certain sectors, it appeared to be working here. Russian defensive lines held under Ukrainian pressure. The summer 2023 counteroffensive encountered exactly what that doctrine was designed to produce: a grinding, attritional approach that cost Ukraine significant resources for modest territorial gain. And here is where the first and most consequential Russian miscalculation was made. Not tactical, psychological. Moscow read the stalled counteroffensive as validation, as proof that the model held, as confirmation that Ukraine could not crack fortified Russian ground and that time was on Russia's side. The Kremlin locked in on that conclusion, reinforced it politically, and began treating static defense not as a temporary posture, but as a strategic answer. That judgment was catastrophically wrong. And the 2 towns that just changed hands are part of the accumulating evidence that Ukraine read that same counteroffensive failure, drew entirely different lessons, and spent the next 12 months rebuilding a force designed to exploit exactly the vulnerability Russia decided it did not have. Let me walk you through what that actually means at the operational level. Ukraine's adaptation between the end of the 2023 counteroffensive and the current period of recapture was not primarily about quantity. It was not about waiting for more Western tanks or more long-range missiles, though both mattered at the margin. The core adaptation was doctrinal. Ukraine shifted from massed, mechanized assault, which had proven expensive against prepared defenses, to a distributed, multi-axis, drone-integrated attack methodology that Russian defensive doctrine had no coherent answer for. The key variable is reconnaissance and suppression sequencing. Legacy static defense assumes that an attacker must expose himself to get close enough to threaten the position. That exposure allows the defender to engage with massed fires, degrade the assault element, and restore the defensive advantage. It is a doctrine built on the assumption that the attacker is essentially blind until he is in range, and that range equals mutual visibility. Persistent drone reconnaissance broke that assumption completely. Ukrainian forward elements are now operating with continuous overhead situational awareness that Soviet origin defensive doctrine never modeled. Before a single ground element moves, Ukrainian forces know where the Russian trench lines run, where the crew-served weapons are positioned, where the command nodes sit, where the logistics tail connects. They know the shape of the problem before they engage it. And that asymmetry, that one-sided battlefield transparency, is what you are watching play out in those 48-hour recaptures. And it gets even more serious from here, because the reconnaissance advantage is only the first layer. The second layer is what Ukraine does with that information at the suppression phase. The strikes that preceded the ground movement on those two positions were not random artillery harassment. They were sequenced. First, the crew-served positions that control the approach corridor. Second, the communications infrastructure that connects the forward defensive position to its command layer. Third, the logistics connection, the ammunition resupply route, the reinforcement path. Strip those three things out of a static position, and what you have left is not a defensive strong point. You have a collection of soldiers cut off from command, running low on ammunition, holding ground that they no longer have the communications infrastructure to coordinate the defense of. That is what collapsed in 48 hours, not a position overrun by brute force, a position that had already been hollowed out before Ukrainian ground forces began their movement. The ground assault was, in the most precise military sense, a confirmation of a decision that had already been made at the suppression phase. Russia was not defeated at the moment of Ukrainian entry. Russia was defeated in the hours before it when its command architecture was severed and its reinforcement routes were closed. Pull the lens back again, because the individual position is not the real story. The real question is, what does this sequencing capability mean at scale across the front? Here's what it means. Every Russian static position along the eastern defensive line is now operating in an environment where Ukrainian reconnaissance sees it continuously, where Ukrainian strike assets can sequence against its internal command and logistics structure, and where the assumption of positional resilience, hold the ground, bleed the attacker, has been invalidated as doctrine. The question is not whether a given position can hold forever. The question is whether Russia can reconstitute command and logistics faster than Ukraine can sequence the suppression cycle. And based on the evidence emerging from those two recaptured towns, the answer right now is no. This matters enormously, because it means the Russian defensive posture is not just under pressure. It is structurally mismatched against the threat it is facing. Let me quantify what that looks like from the Russian side. A static defensive position in this environment requires, at minimum, three things to remain coherent: persistent communication with command, reliable ammunition resupply on a cycle that matches the rate of contact, and the ability to call and receive reinforcement when an assault develops. Take any one of those away and the position degrades. Take all three simultaneously, which is exactly what sequenced Ukrainian suppression does, and the position does not degrade, it collapses. That is 48 hours. That is what the map showed. The broader Russian problem is not simply that two towns fell. The broader Russian problem is that the methodology that took those towns is repeatable. It is template-driven. Ukraine has not found a one-time solution to a specific position. Ukraine has developed a replicable operational sequence that can be applied across multiple points along the defensive line wherever reconnaissance identifies the right conditions. And Russian doctrine currently has no systemic answer to that sequence. Now, let me address the mainstream framing that you have almost certainly seen, because it consistently misses the most important element. The coverage focuses on kilometers. Which towns changed hands? The visual of the map moving. And those things are real and they matter for tracking the conflict, but they create a false impression that the significance is territorial. That if Russia holds most of the line, the loss of two positions is an acceptable tactical adjustment, a local reverse, a manageable data point in a larger static picture. That framing is wrong. Not because the territory is irrelevant, but because it focuses on the output while ignoring the input. What the map movement reveals is not that Ukraine took ground. What it reveals is that Ukraine's suppression sequencing methodology worked. Again, that the drone reconnaissance to strike to ground movement pipeline executed at the operational tempo Ukraine designed it for, that Russian communication and logistics were successfully isolated before ground contact, and that the Russian defensive layer behind those positions did not reconstitute fast enough to prevent the collapse. The territory is the result. The methodology is the threat. And the methodology does not reset when the map stabilizes. And here is the hidden military variable that almost no analysis captures. Russian reinforcement doctrine in this environment assumes that a threatened position can be identified early enough to mass forces for counterattack before the position falls. That assumption made sense when the primary attack indicator was massed armor movement, which is visible, slow, and detectable by multiple intelligence means hours before contact. Against that threat model, Russian reinforcement timing worked. Drone-integrated light infantry assault does not give that detection window. The attack signal is not massing armor. It is a change in drone pattern over a position that Russia's own reconnaissance capability is often too degraded to interpret in real time. By the time a Russian command layer identifies that a position is under coherent attack, not just harassment, but a sequenced assault designed to take it, the suppression phase is often complete and the ground movement has already begun. The reinforcement that Russian doctrine calls for arrives after the decision point has passed. That is not a failure of courage or effort on the Russian side. It is a structural mismatch between the threat timeline and the response doctrine. And it is not a mismatch that Russia can fix by sending more soldiers to the forward line. Sending more soldiers to positions that are under the same reconnaissance coverage and the same suppression sequencing simply adds to the cost without changing the outcome. More bodies in a hollowed out position does not make the position coherent. It makes the casualty count larger. This is the larger pattern those two recaptured towns confirm. And it has been visible for those willing to look at the structural data rather than the territorial scoreboard for the better part of a year. Let me walk you through the compounding consequence chain, because this is where the full strategic weight of what just happened becomes visible. Start at the position level. 2 positions recaptured in 48 hours. Each one represents a Russian investment of fortification engineering, pre-positioned ammunition, and soldier days of occupation. That investment is now destroyed or captured. Russia does not recover it. The material cost is real, but the informational cost is more serious. Every position Ukraine captures gets walked through by Ukrainian military engineers and intelligence personnel who collect data on construction methods, communications infrastructure, and defensive architecture. That data feeds directly into the planning cycle for the next operation. Russia's defensive methodology is literally being reverse engineered by the people defeating it. Move up one level to the operational. 2 towns recaptured in 48 hours creates a salient in the defensive line. A salient is not just territory. It is a geometric problem for the defender. A salient means that Russian forces on either side of the recaptured ground are now holding positions with exposed flanks that Ukrainian forces can threaten from angles the original defensive orientation did not account for. That exposure requires either reinforcement of the adjacent positions, pulling resources from other sectors, or a quiet shortening of the line to restore geometric integrity. Both options cost Russia something. Both options are visible to Ukrainian reconnaissance. Both options feed the next planning cycle. Pull the lens back to the strategic level. What does a pattern of 48-hour collapses in static defensive positions do to Russian soldier morale and to the Kremlin's ability to sustain its narrative domestically? This matters more than Western analysis typically acknowledges. The Russian domestic narrative about this war depends on 2 pillars. First, that Russian forces are advancing or at minimum holding. Second, that Western support for Ukraine is unsustainable and will eventually crack. The first pillar takes visible damage every time a position falls on a timeline that indicates not attrition, but systemic dysfunction. The second pillar has been eroding steadily as Western support has not only continued, but in several critical categories expanded. 48-hour retreats in specific sectors are not, on their own, decisive, but accumulated over time, reported across multiple frontline sectors, and paired with the mounting evidence of Russian manpower and materiel strain, They begin to corrode the internal confidence of the military bureaucracy and the political structure around it. And a military whose internal confidence is corroding makes worse decisions, slower decisions, decisions that prioritize self-protection over tactical necessity. Those worse decisions show up on the ground as further positional collapse, which drives further confidence erosion, which produces further decision-making dysfunction. That is the compounding dynamic. It does not move fast, but it moves in one direction. Now, let me bring this forward to the operational climax that this specific 48-hour window represents. What Ukrainian forces executed across those two positions was not a breakthrough. It was a proof of concept replication, and that distinction matters enormously. A breakthrough is a one-time event that depends on specific local conditions. A proof of concept replication is a demonstration that a methodology has generalized beyond its initial application. Ukraine has now shown, not for the first time, but with increased tempo and compressed timeline, that its suppression sequencing approach works not just against isolated positions, but against adjacent positions in the same defensive sector in parallel. 48 hours for two towns means the operational pipeline is running simultaneously across multiple target sets, not sequentially against one target at a time. That compression of operational timeline is the real story, because it means that Russian defensive doctrine is now facing a threat that operates faster than the response cycle, not marginally faster, structurally faster. The gap between Ukrainian attack tempo and Russian reconstitution tempo is not a gap that Russian commanders can close by working harder within the existing system. Closing it would require either a fundamental restructuring of Russian defensive doctrine, which is not something that happens quickly in any military, and certainly not in the Russian military during an active conflict, or a massive influx of precision suppression capability that Russia does not currently possess and cannot produce fast enough to matter on the timeline this war is operating on. Neither option is available to the Kremlin on the timeline that matters. Let me be precise about what that means strategically. Russia's current defensive posture is not a stable equilibrium that Ukraine is slowly eroding. It is a posture operating past its design parameters against a threat it was not built to handle, maintained by a logistics and command system that is absorbing compounding damage, held together by the institutional inertia of a military that is not yet willing to admit its doctrinal framework is obsolete. That kind of system does not gradually improve. It holds and then it does not hold. The timing of the not holding is uncertain. The direction of travel is not. And here is what history says about this kind of structural military failure, because the precedents matter. When a static defense loses its internal command coherence faster than it can reconstitute it, the positional choice is no longer voluntary. You do not choose to hold or withdraw based on tactical calculation. You withdraw because the position has become tactically incoherent, because the soldiers in it cannot communicate upward, cannot receive resupply downward, and cannot coordinate laterally. The decision to retreat is made not by a general reviewing a map, but by a sergeant in a trench who has been out of communication for 8 hours and has watched the approaches fill with drone signatures he has no electronic countermeasure capacity to address. That is what happened in those two towns, and the general watching it from Moscow does not have a doctrine that fixes it. He has a report that says 2 positions were lost in 48 hours, and a political system that requires him to explain that in terms that do not destabilize the domestic narrative. That gap in between military reality and political requirement is itself a strategic vulnerability, because armies that cannot report their failures accurately to their command layer cannot fix their failures accurately either. The information that needs to flow upward to produce doctrinal correction is the same information that is politically unacceptable to transmit. Russia is caught between military necessity and political constraint in a way that compounds every other vulnerability I have described. Ukraine has no equivalent constraint. Ukraine's command culture in this war has demonstrated a willingness to acknowledge failure, absorb the lesson, restructure the response, and try again faster. That is not a small thing. That is the adaptive advantage that makes the drone suppression sequencing methodology possible, that made the 48-hour recapture possible, and that makes the next 48 hours strategically uncertain for every Russian position that sits inside Ukrainian reconnaissance coverage, which at this point in the war is most of them. So let me deliver the verdict because one is warranted. What happened in those two towns in 48 hours is a case study in asymmetric doctrinal adaptation. Russia built a defense on assumptions that made sense in a threat environment that no longer exists. Ukraine identified those assumptions, systematically invalidated them through operational methodology, and is now executing against the resulting vulnerability at an accelerating tempo. The Kremlin's retreat from those positions is not a tactical adjustment. It is a symptom of a structural condition that two towns cannot resolve, and that the current Russian defensive framework does not have the internal tools to correct. The broader lesson here is not about Ukraine's courage, though that is real and documented in blood across 3 years of this war. The broader lesson is about what happens when one side updates its doctrine and the other side cannot. When one side uses its failures as feedback and the other side uses its failures as propaganda. When one side builds a command culture that can absorb bad information and produce better decisions, and the other side builds a command culture that filters bad information to protect internal narratives. Those differences do not produce dramatic single-day outcomes. They produce exactly what you just watched on the map: 48 hours, two towns, and a Kremlin that has no coherent public explanation for either. History will record this period not as a stalemate interrupted by local fluctuations, but as the phase in which Ukraine's doctrinal adaptation outran Russia's capacity to recognize it had a problem worth solving. The map will keep moving, the tempo will keep compressing, and the structural gap between Russian defensive doctrine and the threat that doctrine is failing to answer will keep widening. The questions that remain, and they are serious questions, are about timeline and political will. How quickly does the compounding pressure produce larger positional collapse? How does the Kremlin manage a domestic narrative that increasingly requires it to explain losses it cannot accurately describe? And what happens to Western resolve if the timeline extends further than political cycles can comfortably absorb? Those questions do not have simple answers. Stay with us, because the next phase of this war will answer them in real time. And understanding the answers before they arrive on the front page is exactly what this analysis is designed to give you.